Hi, this is Privateer Station, and today we bring you another special. In the first 2 days of October, Forum Free Russia organized its fifth anti war conference under the slogan Victory for Ukraine, Freedom for Russia. This event took place in Tallinn, Estonia. Several leaders whom you might know from our podcast, Olexiy Arestovych, Yuri Romanenko, and Ilya Ponomarev, have attended this event, and it turned out to be an interesting discussion. In our yesterday stream, Olexiy did reference also one of the congressmen from leading party in power in Ukraine who participated by Skype in this event and caused some controversy. We think you might appreciate that specific stream, and the usual thanks go to our members. Thank you, PSH and Nhill, for staying with us and upgrading your levels of membership. And thank you, Bill, for your super thanks. You guys make our work a bit easier. And with this, let's listen to this anti-war conference. I think I have good opportunity right now to send my puck on the hockey stick of Olexiy Arestovych and let him express what he thinks on this topic. Because very few in Ukraine communicating in Russian in the first half of this war and later, even now, were looking at that situation, leaving some possibility. And I'll remind the main thesis of Olexiy that if you are not talking to a person with positive motivations, if you're just conducting negative attacks, bullying and shaming at your opponent, you will not reach anything within him. You will not be able to change the person's mind. So I want to give him a question, and I'll put a question in a sharp manner. In our environment, we often dwell in a rather pessimistic state of mind, knowing the state of our society, and we hope for some historic miracle. What gives you basis? What gives you the background to look forward with some optimism? Well, I'm an optimist in general. Thank you for the question. First of all, what I do not like in Russian opposition is the constant apologizing for them being Russian. So that statement, sorry that we are Russians. For us, or for me personally, real fascism is including every Russian into the group. When somebody says that Russians have genetic deficiency, that they are wrong from the beginning, that heavy meta-historic reality looming over Russia made them all scoundrels and slaves, incapable of doing anything, that stirs me wrong way. How do you read that? This is some sort of a race theory. And I think that Russian opposition was tied with that tone. And one of the ways you can see that, when you see how people are trained to respond to glory to Ukraine, glory to heroes, they somewhat slow down and then immediately fire back the response to that phrase. And if you don't say that, like if you won't be led to this hall, to this meeting or anywhere else, you don't have to do that. I don't like such dressage. It is very Ukrainian story, glory to Ukraine. It's the gesture of solidarity that we use. But you, as people of Russia, do not have to use it. That's one. Second, what gives me optimism, I communicate with you and I see huge potential. Let's approach it from this angle. To grieve over heavy karma that Russia might have is part of Russian culture, I think. But Russia has quite a bit of other achievements too. So, haven't we seen alternatives to Russia in the history of Russia throughout the times? Right now, we are the form of alternative Russia. If there was nobody, then yes, one could pose that question and say that Russia is in some very heavy historic phase. And then where would all you go? Because you do exist, it's hard to erase you. When we look at the France of 1943, where was France? Half of them were occupied, half of them agreed to cooperate with Vichy regime, and people could woe and say France is no more, were the times of Napoleon and the kings, and France is lost forever. But somewhere in Britain, there was de Gaulle with his 200 men. And a bit later, we have Free France, an alternative France, and a France that was capable to shrug off the remnants of Vichy and Nazi Germany and bloom to a new state. What is the most interesting feature of these dictatorship regimes is that they disappear within a day. Just like that at the end of USSR, 10 million of people in enforcement agencies. That regime changed effort to hold USSR and make USSR 2.0, and in 3 days they're all gone. Ceausescu, gone in a week with his regime. That can be gone in basically a second. And the level of rational and irrational reasons, it's difficult to predict. But when it will start falling, or when it falls eventually, then we have a question about how manageable is this process. And it's always followed with the matter who is the subject of that management. If there is no Forum of Freedom of Russia, when there is no Russian Volunteer Corps, Legion Freedom of Russia, who will pick up the falling banner? So, such an approach, self-flagellating, self-annihilating approach, is what irks me. I think that Russian opposition deserves to stand straight. I think you are heroes, from my point of view, to act against Putin's regime in these conditions. Inside Russia and outside of Russia, one needs to have a very strong ethic structure inside you and love Russia a lot. That's one. Second, who is the subject? Subject has a negative definition. This is somebody who can say no to an event or to action. So you are all who said no to Putin and his regime. And one of the most important no's that you can also add to that is no to the logic of hopelessness of Russia, in the style of even the best of us have something in our genes that if you don't look over us, if you don't watch over us, will bring up some bloody dictators in our leadership in the next 5 years. Why? Chadaev and other historic figures in your history were not turned into those ghouls by whatever environment was around them. And also, speaking of positive definition of subject, is somebody who can offer goals and program. You guys have goals and program. And as for people, well, think of religious leaders. Muhammad, peace be upon him, had only 12 disciples, and they started pretty well, right? Another person in religious history had also 12 disciples and 12 followers. One of them even betrayed him, but, overall they succeeded. So I can remind the words of Fidel Castro, not to remember him that close to the night, but those who know the history of Cuban Revolution, they had about 70 revolutionaries who landed with him. They lost their people in those mangroves during the operation, and when they finally gathered together, they had only 9 people up in the mountains with Fidel, and they said, "What are we going to do?" And he smiled and said, "Oh, don't worry, there are already 9 of us. The victory is imminent." So, what are we going to prove to ourselves? That we are the people who cannot betray the ideals of your movement when you were not in power, where you were underdogs, when you were oppressed, jailed, killed. We will not be apologizing for that. We will not be apologizing for being Russian. That's what I would say is important for an opposition. You guys need to be strong. You guys need to continue offering alternative, continue being there, and continue resisting. Whether it's a 1-year war, 5-year war, what if it's a 1,000-year war? Doesn't matter. You still need to resist and get rid Russia of its that heavy karma, if we talk in these terms. So we have the goals, the tasks are clear. Let's go and fight. If you need to fight two more years, we'll do that. If you need to fight 20 more, just go do that. Thank you, Olexiy. Thank you. That was a presentation of new psychological trainer by Olexiy Arestovych, How to Raise Self-Esteem by Good Russians. You can sign in after the end of this forum at the exit. Thank you for humor, Yuri. And I hear there's a Congressman Oleg Donda on Skype. I think we can give him a word. Do you hear us, Oleg? Yeah, I do. So I want to give you a microphone to comment on what was said already. All right, I do like to speak last because it's easier to comment on people who said proper. I think Yuri made a very voluminous commentary, sign into the psychological training by Olexiy. You have to speak straight. I want to give due to Garry Kasparov. He had a right thesis about radicalism. There is one nuance, though. Radicalism and the behavior of radical movements is a new normality of the world that exists since 2014. And right now we live basically on the pages of the books of history. And these are the times when the whole world order changes. Relations in Europe, relations between countries, and after this war, we will not be able to recognize the old world, and radicalism will likely still persist, and it will be probably a normal state of things. So I don't think it's productive to look back into the past and say, I did want to go back to the old, cozy world where everything was understandable and so familiar. There will be something different, and in order for it to be not too surprising, we need to hold conferences and other communications to make sure we form such future, and to speak about and discuss about instruments and other things that surprise people. Why am I saying that? For example, last year, I think we were talking in Vilnius with you. There was anti-war conference on the 1st of December, if I'm correct, and Konstantin was there, and we discussed a person who's deceased already, but perhaps they'll revive Prigozhin too. But we talked about Prigozhin, and I did mention that, look, criminalization of the inner mechanisms of government in Russia is revving up. And there may be a time when Prigozhin and his private mercenary corps will recognize their right of strength, and they will start a mutiny in one way or another. And that's exactly what happened in summer. And the other thing is that Prigozhin was lacking certain elements that usually also referenced in regards to being decisive. So, by the way, Mikhail Khodorkovsky made good conclusions from this situation, and he voiced the right conclusions from the events, and he characterized that the power in Russia is now laying on the ground, basically. So whoever has enough strength and who wants to change inner structure of that empire needs to understand that there is only one way to do it. And Prigozhin showed that already. This is the right conclusion, because 5,000 fighters showed that they're a very serious force that even Moscow would be afraid of. That such a monolith-looking empire, from the outside looking so threatening, inside it's very fragile. And during that mutiny, everybody could see how fragile it is. Another reference to Konstantin's speech earlier today, which I think was rather right, is that Russian regime does not have a global support inside. Yes, they function, They command the expeditionary corps that wages war in Ukraine, but very few people are ready to go and die. Most of them are ready to support whoever is strongest. I keep rewatching some of the videos from Rostov when Prigozhin already announced about his move to Moscow, about his march to Moscow, how Rostov citizens were greeting him. This is very symptomatic. That tells that usual citizen of Russian Empire is ready to support whoever has power. Whose power is more charismatic is the one who will get our support. Nothing new for the observer, but this is just another confirmation of this trend. And when we're talking about victory of Ukraine, it's important to notice these things. Why? And here we're going back to the theme of this panel, 4 fronts, 4 conditions of this panel. And even in December last year, I was listening that many so-called good Russians, Georgians, I talk to them a lot, everybody is relying on the victory of Ukraine. And they're hoping that after this victory, they'll be able to take power. And so they're waiting for that to happen. I understand them, but I don't think it is possible. And I'll explain why. Victory of Ukraine is possible today only with joint efforts and joint participation, including you guys on the panel. And I'll explain why. The victory of Ukraine will be created not only on the front line, it also needs to be built in Bryansk, Kursk, Belgorod, Rostov, Buryatia, Siberia, in all parts of Russia. The victory of Ukraine is possible only if these raids, if these attacks on the inner territories of Russia will occur, will continue occurring, will intensify. Without that, Ukrainian victory does not have too many chances, if not to say harsher. And occupant, basic idea is that Russian occupant who is fighting our army in Zaporozhye needs to understand that his background is burning, that colonial expeditionary war is turned into a normal inner civil war. And in this case, the size of Russia is a very useful factor. On one hand, of course, it's good for Russia that it is big, but on the other hand, it is a big drawback because it's very expensive and very ineffective to control such a territory. And they don't have enough resources to do that. That gives enough conditions for such operations to be executed. If Prigozhin can do so much with 5,000 troops near Rostov, on the main roads heading towards Moscow, what precludes people and partisans from doing similar events on the smaller roads and smaller places? Nothing. But that will create enough pressure on the people on the front to go back home and to leave the front and to take care of things at home, because without his aid, things might go to hell in a handbasket. So sort of repeating the situation of 1917 and the First World War, when Russia withdrew from it. So that's one. The other is the condition, not less important, is also creating a certain alternative inside Russia. And in this empty space, there is a chance to create an opposition that might lay claim to power in Russia and topple the regime when it will be wavering. And what I'm talking about, I'm not talking about meetings and balloons and slogans. We will go and agitate and gather together and sing Kumbaya and change the government. That's kids' stories. Look again at the videos from Rostov. Look at what Prigozhin did. So going out in the same way that Russian opposition did before, to squares with slogans and with certain ribbons, that only gives highlights to Putin enforcement agencies who needs to be arrested. So, quoting Khodorkovsky here, the one who has a rifle has power. And I think Russian opposition should be using that as their roadmap. Just a few months ago in Rostov-na-Donu, a very militarized city, a commander of one of the ships that was launching missiles at Ukraine was executed during his morning run. So it is doable. Those people who want to change situation, those people who want to topple the existing power in Russia, they need to understand that the only option they have is armed rebellion, armed resistance. They need to show that they have enough power and they're ready to use it. How to do it? I'm not calling upon you to form legions and go capturing region by region. That's probably not possible. But let's take situation with the same Khodorkovsky, Navalny, Furgal, many examples. When they ended in prison, we know how they got in prison. Of course, there was a command from Kremlin. There were so-called mechanisms that executed these orders. Oleg, do you hear me? You have 2 more minutes. Okay, I'm finishing. There were mechanisms that allowed for that to happen. There were investigators, prosecutors, judges, while the whole community, whole society in Russia understood that those people were innocent, yet were put to jail. So if Khodorkovsky, Navalny, and their supporters want to show that they have power, they need to start punishing those mechanisms that execute illegal decisions carried out by Moscow. Moreover, elites will see that too. They'll see that investigator was murdered, somebody was poisoned, somebody was blown up. That means that there is opposition and it's showing its capabilities. And this will become the beginning of the toppling of this regime inside Russia, of the regime change in Russia, and a process that will bring very different people to power. I don't think there are other options. And a lot of revolutions confirm that. A lot of toppled dictatorship regimes went exactly the same path. And at the beginning of last century, Russia had Vera Zasulich and similar protesters killing czars, people. Olexiy Arestovych wants to say something. Okay, yeah, I'll try to be quick, just 2 minutes. Once again, after Oleg's speech, we are facing the old Russian dilemma. Who is more important, SRs or Bolsheviks? He is offering the classic SR pathway, let's execute the bureaucrats. And I'll remind that Bolsheviks were nobody compared to SRs. SRs had 5,000 bureaucrats murdered yearly at the beginning of 20th century. And they had a very well-set apparatus of terror against Tsar regime. But why did Bolsheviks win? Bolsheviks knew how to win in Russia. And from my point of view, I think you can win only if you win over that guy in Omsk, somewhere in deep Russia, who is eating sunflower seeds and spitting towards Moscow and saying, hey, this is such a shame what's happening in the country. Bolsheviks knew that they needed to turn to that man and to offer him an alternative. SRs never turned to that class. Those were elites and inner elite wars that they waged. And how does the inner Russia look at Moscow? Some fake Dmitris, some fake leaders, some new party leaders, and others are changing. Who cares? I have not left my region further than 16 kilometers. 60% of Russia haven't left further than 20 miles from their house. Who cares about that? Moscow, personally, when I visited Siberia, you can see Moscow from there as some colony on Pluto and all the things happening there. Everything beyond Urals is somewhere so far. So why did they listen to Lenin and Stalin and went to build communism? Because Stalin and Lenin actually reached them. With their executions, repressions, they found ways, but they offered an alternative. What is the danger of the war of attrition? That it becomes from one-time effort, it becomes a way of life. And the way of life in Russia is something that even Stalin failed to change. And I'm finishing here. And if you don't find the right way to communicate to the inner populace of Russia, and why they need to change the way they live, they wouldn't care about empire, anti-empire. That's entertainment for elites. Those groups don't care about it. They need to understand how will their life change and what will they get from it. And he will live longer than Stalin, right? They lived longer than many of those. And if you do not find a way to turn to these people, you will not win. This is how you win in Russia. Alexander, there is another little commentary I want to add. Okay, Oleg, 30 seconds. Okay, 30 seconds, you have it. I want to remind those who didn't study history well, Bolsheviks and communists took power because they were more extreme than SRs. Okay, thank you, 30 seconds. Konstantin, apologies, I'll say something and then I'll let you talk. I think that discussion is taking the right character, and I want to ask a question of Ilya Ponomarev. How much importance does he give to documentaries and different civil activities, civil movements that are full rights participants of the same process that Olexiy was talking about? Of course, we value the armed resistance, and we agree with Belarusians who support their Kalinovsky regiment. We cannot not support those Russians who actually took arms and who are fighting against regime. But I still want to ask you, are you now fully vested only in the armed resistance, or there are other pathways? Well, as the Bolsheviks said, the most important of arts is movie making. I just came from new word, slovo nova, which I think is one of the most important forum of Russian opposition. I think the fight for the minds is happening there. I think you guys do not have platforms to communicate with the wide layers of Russian society, and you probably won't have them until the revolution happens over there. It's very interesting for me to observe the fight between Ukrainian factions that one suggests to be Bolsheviks, another suggests to be SRs. Me, as the old Bolshevik, I guess, and now as an SR representative, sort of, I want to remind everybody that February Revolution was not for the Siberian man. It was a different event. Everything happened after that February Revolution, not before it. February was a revolution of elites, a revolution of the top. But that will all be happening after. Right now we have 4 fronts. First Ukrainian, second Ukrainian, third Ukrainian, fourth Ukrainian, and there are no other fronts. And in Russian opposition, there are only 2 wings. There are no SRs, Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, cadets, whatever. There is a pacifist wing, which suggests to basically capitulate and go participate in the elections that do not exist, to give up your people, your supporters, for political persecution, and the military wing that says, we need to fight. And as Olexiy said, I'm fighting, because there is no other path. We just need to win. We don't have time to think how we win, when we win. We just need to fight. We already are in the situation that makes life much simpler. Of course, we must think how to do it with less casualties, better results, but there is no need to think, do we need to fight or do we not need to fight? We do need to fight. And we need to do that in the framework of a single international coalition, Rammstein coalition, with the leader of Ukraine. And do not ask too many questions about how Ukraine is treating Russians. Is it offending good Russians? Is it believing somebody who doesn't believe in somebody else? There is a good team that's fighting on these fronts, first, second, third, and fourth. And the most sense, what makes now, is to join that team and continue moving forward. It's not the victory of Ukraine. We need to change that rhetoric that Ukraine's victory will mean change in Russia. No, change in Russia will mean victory in Ukraine. There will be no stop in this story until there will be no end to this story while Putin is still in power. And it is not Ukrainian business to change powers in Moscow. It is the business of us who are here in this hall, who are fighting on the front, Russians, the Russian citizens with Russian passports. I'm using the word Russian, living in Ukraine for the last 2 years, but I want to say that I'm talking about Russian citizens. I'm talking about those who fight in Siberian Battalion, in Russian Volunteer Corps, in Legion Freedom of Russia. And I'm glad there are more and more people joining us. And of course, glory to heroes, by the way. Although it is a good statement that Olexiy also made, that the scale of partisan movement in Russia now is times bigger than it was in France during Second World War, if you compare. Many of the colleagues in liberal opposition who are trying to justify lack of action, they're saying these are all just fantasies. All this Russian troops fighting on the Ukrainian front, this is just Ukrainian psyop. There are no Russians fighting there. No, it's not so. Away from the front line, there are several thousand Russian citizens actively engaged in supporting front effort. And on the front line, there are numbers of Russian citizens significantly more than 1,000. It's not enough yet, of course. We need to increase that several times. But this is not already a fraction of 100 or even 100. If we need to grow to some significant number, like Prigozhin had 5,000, you just need to grow it several times. This is not orders of magnitude. This is just several-fold. It's not too difficult. And in the meantime, as Americans are sitting, a bunch of Russians are still sitting on the fence. The way I see it, the fence is really hurting them, and they still haven't made a decision which side of the fence to fall on, to the pacifist or to the active, to the fighting side. And I like this forum. You have a very good formula here about resistance, about the front against Putin. I'm glad to be here on the stage after a pause that was in my activity with that side. And everybody is watching us. Everybody is trying to see, will Russian opposition be able to join these Ukrainian fronts? Can we? And everybody is asking these questions. We need to understand we're walking the same direction. We need one victory. We must work as partners in a partnership mode. Forum Freedom of Russia is one of the best forums of the Russian opposition that proved itself through time. The most representative, the most radical, the strongest. The Congress of People's Deputies are working with legalities and laws. Military units are fighting on the front. Forum Freedom of Russia is joining national liberation movements. Khodorkovsky is negotiating with elites. Everybody has his own front. Navalny group is doing investigations, corruption investigations. They're also the best. Everybody has his own station, his own segment of this front. Do not criticize each other too much. Make sure that you are on the same page, that you understand you're fighting the same enemy, that we are coordinating our effort to achieve a joint victory. Thank you. Yes, thank you, Ilya. I want to give word to Yuri Romanenko. And after his word, we will have some questions and ways to communicate with the panel. So we might even skip the question here, I guess. Support the line exclusively for military resistance, fight, and revolution, as Oleg said, for example, and or do we bet on the borders of 1991 in some framework, and that might change that might require a certain shift in position of Russia. So, in your point of view, what about the perspective of revolution in Russia? Or do you think they'll transform their consciousness in some way that they'll understand that Russia needs to change from within and decide to go back to the borders of 91 and start a new page of history? I'll show you 4 positions from where, as the classic said, the attack on Putin's regime has started. There are 4 fronts that we are discussing here. First one is the front of Ukrainian-Russian war, of course, where very heavy fighting is going on daily and a lot of people die daily. It defines a lot of realities. Second is in a Ukrainian front. It is the front for change of Ukraine, to make sure we change and evolve before we run out of resources. Because Ukraine can win in this war and must win this war, but it will evolve into a very difficult state than it was before the 24th of February in 22. Because if Putin's regime will figure a way to stay alive, stay afloat for years to come, they will have a good experience for themselves and know that democracy is nothing. It can be beaten. The third front is in a Russian front that Ilya was talking about, where the key element for those who are present at this conference is the way Russian opposition is organized. Because how well organized it is will matter in how effective can it be against Putin's regime, and it will affect, of course, the front between Ukraine and Russia. It will affect how the West treats Ukraine and Russia, because that Western front is also important. And we do depend on wide support of the Western communities, both to Ukraine and to Russian opposition, and it will determine the degree and success of fighting on both fronts, on the Ukrainian front and on Russian front. And in this line, our Ukrainian interests and your interests as representatives of so-called good Russians, they're identical. We communicated with several participants during this conference, and we see that those processes that are happening in the United States in the context of presidential election, they carry certain very serious risks to Ukraine. Support of Ukraine may go down. And it's obvious that both us, Ukrainians, and you, Russians, need to maintain communication with Western elites to make sure that in the West, many people are missing a lot of details of these processes. And this misunderstanding leads to mistaken decisions. Not because they're tired, they just don't see the opportunities that reforming Russia and Ukraine brings to the table. Now, in the context of what Olexiy, Ilya, and Konstantin were talking about, Konstantin was talking about Russians not being involved in the war that's happening somewhere too far from them. I think their engagement will grow, because now, as the second winter is coming, and it is obvious that Putin's bet is on the war of attrition to make sure it continues to presidential elections in the United States, and he'll try to negotiate with maybe Trump if he gets elected. On our side, we need to be able to provide a symmetric answer. And symmetric answer will be that Ukraine will start using UAVs and missiles on Russian territory as well. We already are using drones. Recently, we already had some news that Americans said it's all right to use their military tools, the missiles and the rest that they provide to target military objects on the territory of Russia. That's not an issue anymore. Before the war, we saw how United States, every time they ran into Putin's lack of desire to negotiate, about peace. They were stepping up the ante. They were adding ATACMS to the table. They're adding F-16s, tanks, etc. And everybody understands now that if Ukraine will not start destroying the military potential on the territory of Russia, Ukraine will not be able to win this war. Putin will continue this war forever. And this war will be done by the hands of those middle Russia men who see war as a possibility for social elevator. And, lower class people from Siberia, from Tyumen. No, don't say about that. Tyumen, actually, Olexiy, Tyumen is a rich city. There are a lot of wealthy people living there. They probably won't go to fight. But, yeah, no, I would say it's a matter of time. It's a matter of time and perspective when a rich Tymenian citizen will become very poor to citizen of Tyumen and will consider going to the front in the current vector that Russia is going. So the matter of involving Russian population is inevitable. The longer war continues, the more and more Russia will start feeling that the pains of war. Borderline regions will definitely be feeling that this winter, though what Ukraine felt last winter, the attacks on electric stations and other romantic situations that create an opportunity to sit near the fireplace and listen to the crackling of firewood if you have one. And that's what Russia will be facing. So, therefore, I think, and I will agree here with Ilya, that February Revolution was the product of elites back in the 20th century in Russian Empire. And right now, the West and Ukraine, they need to work with elite moods and elite motivations in Russia, because it's hedonists, it's the ones who liked visiting French Riviera, who enjoyed hamon, who enjoyed sending their lovers to somewhere in Switzerland or Italy, and then she was a happy member of the family, so to say. So all these sanctions, all these problems that the West is creating for Russia and Russian elites, it creates a certain motivation in the elite circles who very far from foregoing all the enjoyable achievements of human civilization. So the party of army, party of war in the face of Putin and Shoigu has a potential to get the death blow from hedonists, the same that led Nikolai II in Russian Empire in 1917, where it led it. So as Nevzorov, the other very popular figure in the media sphere, was talking on my stream, we should be using any tool to smash the enemy, anything that is nearby. And we're trying to use it as a country that's being attacked by Russia. Ukraine is grabbing at every stool, basically, and Russian resistance is one of these tools that we managed to grab upon. And we're trying to use you to defend ourselves. And during the first months of war, when the question was very sharp, shall we survive or shall we not? All our parties and all our political colors, whoever loves Zelensky, Poroshenko, etc., we all understood that we need to fight back, so everybody was helping everybody to solve the key question. And I'm about to finish. As for Putin, the whole Russian opposition is in about the same boat. Because for as long as Putin is in power with his team, you will be the opposition abroad. Some of you, together with us, will be fighting on the front and will carry the brunt of the losses. But any perspectives will be not so real, and they'll be remote. That means that everybody needs to man his or her station and join that fight. Not everybody can go fight the physical war on the front. If they can, here, communicate with Ilya. If you can do media activity, and here I agree, we need to change the tactics of Russian opposition. Perhaps Putin needs to be praised so much that that deeper Russian man would start vomiting from listening all this praise about Putin. Perhaps find other more creative ways, because usual condemnation doesn't seem to get to him. And as a classic said, you should study, study, and study to find ways to finish off with Putin regime and his clique that brought us to that state of madness in this world in which we in Ukraine have already been since 2014. Thank you. Thank you, Yuri. I see Konstantin wants to add something here, and I have a simple suggestion. You ask questions, and speakers answer what they want to say and not exactly follow your question. Whoa, that's an interesting strategy you're suggesting. All right, let's just add some questions and let him say whatever he wants to say in response. And the same thing we'll do with Olexiy, Ilya, Oleg, and Yuri. We have about 20 minutes to ask questions, to comment, so we have time. And there are microphones in the back too. Can I ask a question of everybody, so whoever wants to answer? Okay, 2 minutes. In the framework of Forum of Freedom of Russia, there starts some work to create, to be created in different countries. The branches of this forum starts to pop up in different countries, in Germany, in Finland, in Estonia. Our forces are rather weak. It is not the mass outcome like big meetings that we saw. It's we're still at the nascent stage, but it gives us a certain way to communicate with the population of each country and with the elites. So to follow Romanenko's message, to communicate with the foreign elites is important. So would you suggest anything, any ideas, how can we reach out better to media, to elites in the country where we are? I liked the additional effort to ban and to sanction certain personalities from Russia, sanction certain companies that work with Russia in Finland, in Germany, in other countries, and find ways maybe to punish those companies. What are your suggestions? What can we pursue here? All right, Konstantin now has a chance to answer this question. All right. So today my name is Al Pacino and I work as a devil's advocate. If you watch the movie, you'll understand what I'm talking about. So I agree it is good strategy to create branches of this forum. It is important. They will be doing even smaller gatherings in smaller format, meetings, petitions, media approach in their countries. They will be showing that there is alternative, that there is an alternative opinion in Russia. And there are people, there are Russian citizens who do not refute the possibility to change situation in Russia. This is an existential choice of path. This is a very important moment because that grows geography. And even in the age of virtual reality, the age of YouTube, etc., personal presence, personal communication still matters a lot. Nobody can replace that. Now about advocating, if not the devil, but attempt to throw additional ideas that we need to think about. We're still going back to 1917, some historic references to SRs, to Bolsheviks, to February Revolution. Listen, why did Bolsheviks achieve success? Because they very targetedly, in the country where 80% of people were illiterate peasants and agriculture sector workers, they promised to solve the question of land tomorrow. Of course, they lied. They did not address this question. They put those same peasants in their gulags. But at the moment, in 1917, the revolution was done by people, Bolshevik revolution was done by people who knew how to lie successfully. And I think we should not exactly follow these steps, because right now we are dealing with a different Russia, both the West, Ukraine, Russian opposition. we're dealing with a different Russia. Most of Russians are city dwellers. Russian society is very fractured by levels of income and capabilities. And today's audience, and I'm very much in agreement with Olexiy, with Ilya and Konstantin, we talked about some explosions of gas pipes, oil pipes that happen in Russia. It's not important who blows them up. But what's important is that after Prigozhin's mutiny, which was, of course, not about the change of system, but the places within the system, we learned one thing. Putin revealed himself to be weak and indecisive. He gave two totally contradicting orders during 8 hours in one day, and this will play its role on the bureaucracy ruling in Russia. I think they definitely should be targeted, should be the target audience. And all these ongoing fires and the rest, that actually falls on their shoulders too. Explosions and everything, because they will have to answer for lack of electricity, lack of fuel, lack of other things. So it seems to me that creating certain pressure on the bureaucracy and administration in Russia on all levels is already happening. It'll be an interesting element of what's happening in Russia. And the last thing I want to say briefly is that during my 2 visits to Ukraine this year, one was in spring, one was 10 days ago, I was very curious to see, and with a lot of positivity, how the approach of those whom I met with is changing to communication with Russian opposition, with Russians that are critical towards Putin. And I understand there is definitely some pragmatism in Ukraine about that, because this is Ukrainian interest, and I think this is a good vector that starts to shape up, because this is that healthy realism that both sides need to successfully fight. Thank you, Konstantin. Daria Wagner from Copenhagen has a question, and she needs to ask a question that maybe Ilya or Olexiy may answer. All right, so you saw the contrast very sharply between what European politicians are waiting from us. Prime Minister of Estonia said Russians in the framework of legal means. And at the same time, Ukrainian SRs, Ukrainian Bolsheviks from Russia saying that the fight is necessary by any means, and the more fight, the better. Do you guys think you can come to some agreement that those Russians who want to work in the framework would also be somehow with your team and would understand what can we do? All right. Daria, I think you did not quite get the context that Thomas was talking about. He was talking on the background of the vehicles of Russian citizens that are banned from entering Europe. He was saying that here in Europe we have laws and Russians need to follow them and not demand special treatment. Thomas actually is a representative of a pretty rare party, unfortunately, of European politicians, who says we need to fight. I wish there were more like him, who says there should be more legions. This is the real resistance that's needed. Politicians in the countries of Baltic, in Ukraine, in Poland, they're all taking that similar position, which is different from position of French and German politicians, who are saying, yeah, don't involve in actual physical fight. So here I wanted to also mention that with in light of a previous question, because I think it's important. Communication with the West and Western elites is super important for us. And this is because right now everybody is still afraid to think what is the victory of Ukraine. They're afraid to think what will happen after. That unknowingness, potential chaos, maybe civil war in Russia, the deterioration, dissolution of Russia, it scares a lot of them, with nuclear weapons somewhere stored there on the territory. So we need to keep suggesting that discussion in all communications with the Western politicians, Western governments. The change of power in Russia is inevitable. Putin is mortal. It will occur. It will happen. And we will be responsible for what's going to happen after that. We need to start thinking about that now and prepare to the risks that this will bring. And the fall of dictatorial regime always brings risks with it. It's better to start thinking about these risks now than when it actually occurred. And we should not be looking for some tones, shades of Russian opposition. We should take your own position, coordinate with all countries of Ramstein coalition. And we, as the representatives of Russian opposition, are ready to participate in that, ready to work with it, ready to talk about what's happening there and suggest our ideas being the part of that process, and try to not attack each other and not hinder each other, because we are fighting for the same goal. Olexiy, Strategy 18 in Vilnius. Good morning, everybody. I have a question to Pan Arestovych. Please answer me. Do you think that Russia and Ukraine need to join together for a bigger success in Europe? At the beginning of war, you said that if Ukrainian and Russian armies can join, that there will not be a force in Europe capable to resist that joint military. Do you still want to occupy Europe? So you said the question, right? I still want to finish is if Ukraine and Europe need to build their relations with Russia. All right. Honestly, putting my hand to the heart, I want a monarchy, and I even have the candidacy of Tsar. For Ukraine or for the joint country? I'm thinking in the category of the local group of galaxies, but yeah, I can start with united Russia and Ukraine. Why do we need a joint Ukrainian and Russian opposition? To not let Western elites go to sleep. What is the main task? To not let them sleep. We are in an interesting side of this discussion, and following Russian citizens who are supposed to be mostly citizens, right? So they're dwelling in cities, not in villages. So let's go from Siberian guy to Rostov fella with a cell phone who was taking selfies with Prigozhin troops and who was shouting "Ganьба," which is a Ukrainian word, not Russian word. And one of the main entertainment for Rostov citizen is to see which of elites will take over in Russia. Nobody managed to overcome, to conquer, and to make those people obey and follow their laws. Neither Stalin nor Gulags nor anybody. Those people still have their own mind. Putin tried to initially change something and run stuff and change the society and do things. And after a few efforts, he decided to be a czar. He figured he will not be able to change things at large. And in my calculations, he started being a czar in about 2010. So, speaking of the Western elites, who's closer to elites? You? Us? The citizens of Russian cities or Russian elites? So, elites are always better talking to elites. This is where we can be mostly effective. We need to join with Russian elites who want to get rid of Putin, to make sure we establish good communication between them, help them with communicating with Western elites. And the main message needs to be that Putin is finite. Ukraine may join NATO, Ukraine may join EU. Whatever happens, Putin will be over with eventually in 26 and 36 and 45, whatever. Sometime it will happen. And what will happen after? You will have to look into the eyes of Rostov and Omsk citizen, those guys from those cities. And they'll be still taking selfies and eating sunflower seeds. So why do they need to see an alternative, need an alternative Russia for them? They need to see that at least you are fighting with the current leader. They may despise you, they may think you're too weak, they may see that, 1,800 Russians on the front will not change situation drastically, but that you exist, and that Western elites are also need to see that. If, for example, it's just 40 people here in Estonia, you should not let local elites sleep. If it is 800 people department in New York, they need to stir New York up. They need to continue sending the message that Putin is finite. And we will be supporting you as Ukraine because you are an alternative Russia for us that we want to be that. We're not running away. We have the same border. We have 2,500 miles border with each other. And we've lived for different centuries together and apart and interacted. A third of us have friends and relatives in each other countries. We're destined and chained with the same link. So what I'm saying here is you need to make sure the Western elites, from local municipalities to big elites, do not fall asleep on this topic of Ukraine and war on changing Putin. And everybody in Russia, in Siberia, in the Far East, anywhere, must see that there is an alternative. And the alternative is fighting. And if there would be no support to Russian fighters on the Ukrainian front, there'll be nothing. And I'm quoting Vaskov from The Dawns Are Quiet Here, cult movie. War doesn't hear screams. War hears only bullets. And that's what we need to make sure the opposition still does. The best way you can do for Putin, the best thing is to cease armed fighting. And resistance can be different. It can be on the front line, it can be destruction of military objects in Russia. That's the only thing that they'll hear. That's the only thing that will not let elites sleep. The main thing that was concerning for me, and still is, the lack of support of Russian opposition that is still sitting on the fence, that they don't want to fully acknowledge the fighting side of that opposition. We need not just alternative Russia, we need alternative fighting governance of Russia. So political and military representatives of Russia in exile, of Russia against Putin, need to cooperate in different ways. But the main task for today and main condition for today, in order to pique interest of both Western elites and inner Russian citizen, is continuation of armed fight. If there'll be no shots heard, nobody will hear you. They'll hear only those who are fighting. They'll hear Ukraine and they'll hear Putin's Russia who are fighting on the front. If alternative Russia is not shooting, it's not going to be on the map. Let me follow with a question. Do you want to still occupy Europe? Hang on, I have an answer here. As an official interpreter of Olexiy, what you're asking is torn out of context. What you're referring to is Olexiy was making the statement when he was still an advisor to the office of the President of Ukraine, and he was saying about the threat of what happens when Russia captures Ukraine. He was saying that Europe and the United States, here is the threat. If Russia manages to occupy Ukraine, then the joint Russia and Ukraine, in this case, as it has always been in history, they represent a severe threat to Europe, because eventually and inevitably they will start marching towards the West. This is the important context, because outside this context, you're basically putting a question as if Arestovych sitting next to Zelensky in bunker was dreaming about fighting together with Russia against Europe, which is insane. Yeah, right. Okay, so we unfortunately have to deal with different phrases being torn out of context. And this is one of those examples, the question that you asked. All right, so we're out of our framework, but we can add 7 or 8 more minutes, and I want to add an opportunity to ask maybe 2 questions. So, once again, despite of your question, we'll give freedom to our speakers to answer how they see fit. Maybe let's ask several questions, and then we'll try to answer some of them. All right, hello, I'm journalist Batir. And you did mention that Ukraine and Russia are joined with the same link. But we're facing a situation now that when we are going to a meeting to a protest meeting in Prague, For example, there is Ukrainian protest, 1,000 people show up. Then there is anti-Putin meeting and 200 more people show up. But when liberal or anti-Putin Russians visit the Ukrainian opposition meeting, a Ukrainian meeting in support of Ukraine, they're being heckled and sent away. We don't want to see you Russians in our protest meeting here. And so Western societies see a very divided group of protesters. And they see that Russian group is a small one. We could unite, we could join together, right? Ukrainians often say that you guys need to unite, but I see on practice it's still difficult. There are still things separating us. Okay, another question here, a question for Oleg Dunda, who is probably the only one who is in some political capacity, being a congressman of Ukraine. Oleg, do you think we should change the slogan Russia without Putin to the world without Putin? And maybe we should unite in some capacity, which I don't think I heard today, that including trade. Trade needs to be limited with Putin, because Finland, as a member of NATO, finally, through the borders of Finland, through the border of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzia, Russians trade with them grew tenfold during the times of war. And you can say the same about Lithuania, Poland, Estonia, any country that borders with Russia. Trade is still going. A huge number of trucks are still crossing the border and unloading anything you want. The shops of Kiev and Tallinn are not as good as the shops of Moscow in assortment. But at the same time, these trucks are also bringing military components, oftentimes, and you can find them whenever you search through the rubble of what attacked you, through the rubble and the remnants of missiles and UAVs that are attacking Ukraine. Oleg, what do you think, as a man being in power, what can you do to stop it and to change that slogan to world without Putin? Okay. Let's formulate the next question, try to do it as fast as we can. Hello, my name is Sergei Kovalchenko, I'm a journalist from Petersburg, but I live here now, and when we ran into this war that Putin started, we understood that all Russians are sanctioned, even the infants, they're under sanctions now. So a question to you guys at this stage. Europe has done their homework for Putin so that Russians would join around him. I understand that nobody cares about people who has relatives across the border. But as for Russian opposition, we are now in the survival mode in Europe. Somebody is washing dishes, somebody is driving vehicles, taxis and all, and we really have no time to dedicate any energy to political effort to fighting the regime. What do you think? How do you answer that? What can we do? All right, fourth question, last question. We'll talk the rest after hours. You have a way to ask speakers later on the fields of conference. So please give us question number 4. Hello. Shmagi Samharadze, civil agreement. I came here from Georgia, from Tbilisi. Here we talked about free Russia, about other Russia, about good Russians. I want to tell you that young people in Georgia, they do not believe in these things. They're very critical about them. I lived in Russia myself for about 10 years. After the August war in Georgia, I moved. And I'm getting to my question briefly, sorry. On the backdrop of the war in Ukraine, there are a lot of Russians, Belarus, Ukrainians who came to Georgia, and there are some people came from Ossetia and Abkhazia to Georgia as well. And my organization is building communication with these people. So I want to ask from future rulers, I guess, or politicians of these countries after the regimes fall, how do you see communication with Georgia, with the North Caucasus and Russia in the future? All right. So we have a few questions. One of them, should we make the border control stricter? We have a question about how Ukrainians and Russians can cooperate beyond the border in some actions. I think what we're doing here is an obvious answer. A question about whether we should be completely not grateful to the governments of different countries and giving us humanitarian visas. And I don't think we can actually say that these countries and their governments don't care about the refugees from Russia. Everything is more difficult, and Ukraine. And a question about, and we can expand that, how Russia in the possible future scenarios will be able to interact with neighbors. All right, let's start with you, Yuri. Oh, I have a mic. Let me briefly answer these two questions. So, the fact that Russians are suffering, all kinds of Russians are suffering because the war started, this is objective reality. Because when you're saying that you are in immigration now, you have to work, it hurts, life sucks. I'll give you a simple example. I live in the center of Kiev. I have a 3-month-old son and a couple daughters. Every day I face a situation that, and I've shown a video yesterday, they're flying 300 yards above my head near the house. They can fall on us at any moment. And this is objective reality. Everybody suffers. Somebody more, somebody less. I have neighbors who are being rolled around on the wheelchairs without hands, without legs, who lost their limbs during this war. Tens of thousands of cripples who you understand what their perspectives in lives are. So when you're suffering, remember that your sufferings on the backdrop of what's happening in Ukraine, where the next stage of this grinder is starting and probably another 100,000 will be mobilized because Putin is aggregating a new horde. That's the situation we are facing. And Europe and West, they are tired of separating better Russians from worse Russians, and this one is a little better than the worst one. This is just objective reality. You will have to suffer as long as this horror that's sitting in Kremlin will die one way or another. Speaking of Ukrainians that have some qualms with Russians, look, situation with every person is very specific. For example, I lived in Bucha, or you lived somewhere else, and you end up here living in Prague, for example. These people went through traumas that perhaps will leave an imprint on them, on their conscience for the whole life. Right? There's a lot of PTSD. There are quarrels and discussions in Ukraine about Russian language because we have a lot of inner issues that we're trying to overcome. So the only thing I can advise you is to increase the power of your organization. When you'll be calling on people and there'll be more people showing up and Ukrainians will see that this is effective and you will be still open to communications, Ukrainians will be joining you. They'll be coming to join you too. Everything will be well. For now, just understand and please forgive these people when they have a certain preemptive attitude towards you just because of historic events. Alexei, should we give a chance to Oleg to answer? He's only one remote, and we didn't want to leave him from answering the question. Thank you, Alexander. First of all, I would want to see Grigory and want to communicate with him. What Yuri said, there is one factor. In Ukraine, without your fight in this war, I don't think it will be very difficult for us to win. We don't have access to Siberia, to Russian men somewhere in the middle of Russia. We don't have this access. You do. So without your inner fight, our victory and our return to the borders of 91 is a very difficult and almost impossible task. So here we have to work together, and you don't need to wait for Ukraine to win. You shouldn't. Speaking of Grigory's question, the world without Putin and sanction politics. I would not keep it that concrete. I would expand that question. Putin is not a single man making these decisions. Putin is an answer to a message or appeal of the inner people in Russia. So I think the message should be the world should be without empire in any capacity, and it should be with the country that went through some process of denazification. And as for international relations and sanctions, we are at a point where the world changes, where it starts to separate who is with the Western world and who is with the dictatorial world regime. And this is a big problem that Ukraine will not be able to solve alone. So we have to work very closely with our Western allies, with Paris, Berlin, London, Washington, and to keep explaining that without the secondary sanctions and a pressure on the countries like Turkey, Armenia, Georgia, and their politicians, the Western success in forming the future security for the world and new scheme of security for the world will not be successful. So 2 last replicas and we will be finishing here. 2 colleagues from Georgia at the end of November will have a special discussion about relations with people and the countries of Caucasus. So not to waste time on that, this is a long conversation and a long answer. But about the meetings and immigration. All Western governments and other diasporas, they take Russians as potential threat to national security. This is the first concern. Everything else you need to prove. In Ukraine, when we just started forming these armed units and we're going to the front with the first group, we're stopping at the gas station. I remember this episode. You know, my face is recognizable. Everybody else is dressed and the face is covered in camo, and I'm not. And the owner of the fuel station comes to me and says, if that's what I think it is, I wish them all to die. And then a few months later, when we were stopping back at the same station again, he came to me and said, remember I told you that early in the war? I feel very ashamed for that phrase, and please forgive me. This is about participation in meetings, about washing dishes or difficulties of life. One of our speakers said earlier, great today, first you need to prove how useful you are, what is your usefulness, and then we'll talk to you about vehicles and visas and education and bank accounts and everything. You need to prove yourself first. This is bitter, but very realistic truth. Same thing with Ukrainians about these meetings. You guys need to prove yourself first. And yesterday I was in another session. There are many people here who are helping Ukraine with money, with projects, etc. What everybody is waiting to happen from Russians is not helping Ukrainian military, but actually helping, see how you guys are helping your Russian detachments on the front. Because the rest of aid is just a drop in the ocean, it's not too visible. And the public opinion is that Russians do not really help Ukrainians too much. But they're asking a question often and often, do you support your own troops on the front? Why Ukraine is keeping them on the budget? Why Russians do not support these troops? So this is one of our main tasks here, first of all, is support of Russian armed resistance on the Ukrainian front, away from the front line as well, in logistics chains, etc. And when people will see that, they will come and join us in the meetings, you'll get your visas, you'll get your vehicles allowed, when people will see that we're actually actively fighting and not just ask for more rights. Thank you. And the last word, Olexiy, I want to support Ilya here. Look, you're not being... It's difficult to see you from other Russians, right? They're not distinguishing you one from another. So in England, in 1943, you could ask a question, are you from Vichy or from de Gaulle? and there was a very different attitude. Then, how do you distinguish now between the Russians? Okay, if you are on the anti-Putin meeting, then you see that these people are against, right? That's at least some hint. But many of you, when you're in normal life, you don't carry anything, right? Many people, they understand the force, and it doesn't have to be a military force. A good example is Amish organizations in America. There are 300,000 of them, right? But they do not carry arms, but and they don't even refuse to take fork often, but they are the agricultural lobby, and they are to be considered with. So you guys need to make more effort to be different, to show that you are different, that you are different Russia, that our Russians are the ones who are storming Putin's troops near Bryansk, the ones who are possibly being partisans deep in Russia who are marching towards Moscow, than those who are still suffering from PTSD after losing their relatives in Bucha. They will not feel ashamed of being on the same meeting, in the same meeting with you guys, because they'll see you as the ones who are actively fighting against Putin. And for now, if we switch to the system of mythology, if Hollywood wanted to shoot a movie about other Russians, what is the archetype? How is he walking? How is he or she talking? Why is that person different from other Russians? And the task of developing that character is the main task. So you could be compared with Putin's Russian. It's very difficult to see you different otherwise. Exactly. You need to develop a rhetoric, and others swim differently, quack differently. So the world would see that it's a different duck, not the one that it's talking about. Then you'll have new relations and more opportunities, etc. Thank you very much. And on this, we conclude our roundtable. Thank you, our speakers.